I'm Raymond Terrific. This is for your weekly gullet full of the massively important. Do you know what sketch I'm talking about? Do you have any clue?
Nope, none.
From ScienceSortOf.com, you're listening to Science Sort of.
You are listening to Science Sort of. This is episode 322. Our theme this week is Drawn to Neanderthals. I am your host, Ryan Halpton. Joining me to talk about the science, things that are sort of science, and things that wish they were science. It's Patrick Wheatley. He's still here. Did he leave?
Hey,
what happened?
Hey, I even know which way to talk into the mic this time. So.
Good to have you back.
Back in the saddle. Yeah, definitely.
As we talk over each other like we haven't been doing this for a decade. I mean, at a certain point, we probably could have started using video calls to do this, but, you know, I think it would just feel even weirder to try to record this while looking at you.
Yeah, or trying to look at myself, which inevitably I would do if we were using video calls.
Yeah, it makes me self-conscious, right?
Right.
Like, I'm a little glad that as the world has transitioned to everything being virtual, that people are now a little bit more aware of, you know, lighting and mic placement and background noise and stuff like that. It's funny, I think everything kind of transitioned to virtual so quickly, though, that, like, everyone kind of figured it out differently, and it's been a little haphazard. Like, I still regularly am on big conferencing calls, you know, with some of the groups I'm affiliated with, and inevitably there's one person who doesn't like mute themselves when it would be appropriate to do so and says something or has a background noise happening that's completely inappropriate or weird or disruptive. And it's just, yeah, I don't know, man. I feel like podcasting trained us well for this new lifestyle of hanging out online and talking to our friends over microphones.
You're not wrong. I feel like I had the job I have now, I had a phone interview for as the first cut. And I feel like that was useful practice.
So it's like we had a secret superpower that we developed before the end of the world that came in very handy once the world ended.
That's right.
I'm into it. Well, speaking of the world ending, the world had to begin at a certain point. And in terms of humanity, it began with some hominid species, one of which were Neanderthals. That's right, Neanderthals. I don't know why this became an advertisement for the concept of Neanderthals. This week, I'm super excited that I got to talk to Jeffrey Brown, who is a comics artist, cartoonist, illustrator, author. He's written a ton of stuff. We talk about it in the interview. I read a bunch of his indie comics back in the early 2000s when there was kind of an indie comics boom, but then he has transitioned to more kids stuff. So he's done a bunch of the Darth Vader adventures, like Vader and Son, Star Wars books. But the reason I wanted to talk to him is because a while ago, he and I were corresponding and we were talking about getting him on the show because he was working on a book about Neanderthals. And when I met him, I mentioned I was a paleontologist. So I was actually like going back and forth with him on, you know, the little bit of anthropological science that I do know, or at least my ability to know how to go look up a peer-reviewed article. But we never got around to actually having him on the show. And it was one of those where I had the email in my inbox and I realized like, oh my gosh, I never responded to him about actually doing the interview. And so, you know, years after the fact, I emailed him and was like, hey, you know, sorry, I botched this. And if you ever did have an interest in coming on the show, you know, you're more than welcome to, and hope you're doing well. And then like he responded immediately and was like, oh yeah, like no worries. Sounds good. Let's schedule the interview. So, yeah, I read the comics. He's got a new one coming out. That's a space themed one, a little bit less science, more sci-fi. And so, but for the first half of the interview, we stick pretty strictly to talk about Neanderthals. So let's go give it a listen. All right, I am being joined by Jeffrey Brown, who is the author of the Lucy and Andy Neanderthal series of comics, as well as the upcoming Once Upon A Spacetime. And you may have seen his books featured as the Star Wars, Darth Vader and Son, Jedi Academy, lots of other stuff. I remember I started off with Be a Man back in the day. But
definitely not for kids.
No, definitely not. But Jeffrey, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I think I first became familiar with your work on Around Comics.
Right, yeah.
And we've actually had Tom Caters on this show to talk about
Nice.
the science of the Flash. So there's a little interesting crossover there. But yeah, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good mostly. Yeah.
A little peek behind the curtain. You know, we're speaking right as the COVID-19 coronavirus is kind of sweeping across the U.S. and affecting a lot of daily life, and it's a little freaky, but we've been trying to get this scheduled for a very long time, so we went ahead. I wanted to go ahead and still chat because I thought chatting about some comics would make me feel better. So I guess I should have talked about this off mic, but I guess can we talk a little bit about how you got started making comics? You know, I've like I said, I kind of first discovered you as one of the indie people in kind of the early to mid aughts. I think there was like an indie autobio slice of life boom a little bit, and I feel like you were in the forefront of that. So is that when you started making comics or getting published, or what's your story?
I was making comics ever since I was a kid, basically. Like when I was a kid, that was my dream, was to grow up and draw comics, like specifically for Marvel. And, then by the time I got into college, I was kind of turning to fine art and had kind of drifted away from comics. But then while I was in grad school for my MFA, I kind of rediscovered with, Julie Doucet and Dan Clowes and Chris Ware, and kind of reopened my eyes to the possibilities of comics. And I started out writing some autobiographical comics about relationships. And so that was like 2001 is when I kind of started writing and self-publishing, and that kind of led to doing, also doing some humorous and parody kind of stuff too, which was like always like having the two sides of the kind of the more serious emotional stuff and then like the goofy fun stuff.
Yeah, you do something like Incredible Change Bots and then A Matter of Life, and I feel like those are two very different tones.
Yeah, I feel like, and I feel like my autobiographical work, I've always tried to put humor in as well. But yeah, there's something about doing like a parody of the Change Bots where I'm kind of trying to draw them like super clunky and not slick like you see in the movies these days, and just really trying to like have fun with ideas and see what happens.
Well, I'd been a fan of your work for a while, just because I was, there was a period in time for comics readers, I think, like I was saying, kind of the early to mid aughts, where once a year Top Shelf Comics would do these huge sales, and you could just get a giant stack of top shelf books. And I think that's how I originally collected a lot of your stuff. And then I read Matter of Life, and Matter of Life was when I first realized that you're actually kind of a science guy.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in science. I mean, like when I was a kid, definitely in terms of like for sixth grade, I went to a school called Zoo School, which was like this tiny school. There was two classrooms with two teachers, and then the classes would switch halfway through the day, I think, or maybe like every semester or something. But it was right on the campus of the zoo in Grand Rapids. And, so kind of the normal sixth grade curriculum with an extra helping of like zoology and biology and, life sciences.
I am so incredibly jealous. That sounds awesome.
It was awesome. And I even got to be a junior zookeeper. So like there was a system where you could earn points for grades and completing projects. And once you reach a certain level, then you're eligible to become a junior zookeeper, where you get to go for a week and you spend like the morning of each day in the zoo working with the zookeeper. So, I spent one day working with the zookeepers in the South American exhibit, and I got to prepare the salad for the Galapagos turtle and, wash out the capybara enclosure.
Oh, that's so cool.
With a hose. And another day I remember I got to scoop the poop out of the wildebeest zebra enclosure, and they gave me a wheelbarrow and a shovel, and they're like, and I was like, okay, this is cool, I'm going to be in there. And they're like, and if the wildebeest charges at you, just hit it on the head with the shovel. And I, to this day, I'm like, how serious were they?
Right. I got mock charged by a peccary once at a research station down in Costa Rica, and I've been charged by a couple of animals, but that was the one where this wildlife station, because the big cats don't really come around the wildlife or the biological research station, the peccaries have just taken over and everywhere. And Yeah, when
Yeah.
an animal charges you, even if they know that they're just doing a mock charge, it is effective. I see why that
Yeah.
behavior has evolved.
Yeah, in the end, I was never charged, but I did scoop a lot of wildebeest and zebra
Have you seen the video of the woman trying to clean out the panda enclosure at some zoo in China?
No,
Oh,
no.
I will send you a link to that afterwards. It's because
Right.
the pandas want to knock over the bucket of leaves and play. And so it's all these baby pandas, it's like little baby pandas.
Yeah.
And she is, I don't understand what she's saying, but her tone is clear that she's so annoyed by these completely adorable little pandas that just keep knocking her, like trying to steal her broom. And it's really funny. Like, and clearly they're filming it because they knew that this would be a good bit because they,
Right.
yeah. So after I read Matter of Life, I tracked you down at San Diego Comic-Con a couple of years ago and introduced myself, and we exchanged information, and you told me you were working on a Neanderthal comic. So I know we want to promote the book that's coming out soon, but I thought we could kind of go both chronological in terms of the order you wrote and published the books, as well as chronological in the timeline of the two series.
Yeah.
And you talk about this a little bit at the end of the first book, but yeah, can you talk about what made you want to tell a story of this family of Neanderthals?
Yeah, so I mean, it started with childhood, but the initial catalyst for the story of Lucy and Andy as characters came because I was invited to actually pitch a cartoon for Nickelodeon, and I was like, okay. And I didn't expect anything to come out of it, but I thought it'd be interesting to do, and I was like, what can I make a cartoon about? And so as a kid, I was always interested in dinosaurs and prehistoric life. I watched the Flintstones a lot, but there's not a lot of scientific background in the Flintstones.
Not until Mark Russell came along and made up the Cave of Science. I don't know if you read his series, but there's a science cave in the.
I haven't.
It's really good.
I think I saw the first issue and then I didn't keep up with it. But yeah, I was like, and that was this was around 2010 when they're just sequencing the Neanderthal genome, and there's kind of I felt like there was a big jump in the amount of articles and news stories about Neanderthals and new discoveries. And I was like, well, maybe I can do something like the Flintstones, but with this, like, inject it in with a bunch of science and kind of make it the world that these Neanderthals are living in more grounded, and just like little things. Like, one of the things is I never really thought about stone tools, like beyond like, here's a stone tool, and like the actual science of how, not only how stone tools are made, but how we know how like Neanderthals and early humans made stone tools. And so
I feel like as Americans we're biased towards thinking about like things like arrowheads and spear points, and that's pretty advanced technologically compared to the stuff the Neanderthals were doing. Yeah,
and not only is it advanced, but like how far back it goes is also like amazing. Like going all the way back, million years to and thinking about when the periods of time like where there is like jumps and innovations of tool technology. And so I pitched this. I came up with these two Neanderthal kids characters, Lucy and Andy, a brother and sister, living, and I placed it right around 40,000 years ago, so I'd get the overlap of humans and Neanderthals. And I felt like that would be an interesting time to set it, where I could kind of talk about migration and populations changing. And yeah, I pitched this cartoon, and Nickelodeon was like, oh, this is interesting, not really for us, which is kind of what I expected. And then I just put the idea on the shelf and spent 5 years doing Star Wars books, basically. And then I got kind of burnt out on Star Wars and was like, I need to find something else to do. And I realized that I could dust off this idea about Neanderthals and do it as a book series instead of a cartoon. And that's kind of where it started, I guess.
That's really cool. You said you were getting burnt out on Star Wars, but I noticed a few Star Wars things slipped into these books. Mr. Darrell, when he gets his new robes, has a very distinctive look, I'll say.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm a big Star Wars fan too, so I couldn't help.
Yeah, there's little inside. I mean, like honestly, there's little inside jokes about Star Wars. Like if you look through my work, like even back through the autobiographical stuff, there's little jokes and things. And
I think my favorite in Lucy and Andy was the well, hello there. I really enjoyed that. Well, that's really cool. So you and I corresponded a little bit about Neanderthals because you heard I was a paleontologist. I don't work on anything that recent, especially not when it comes to hominids. But I did what I could. But you had some scientific help in addition to the research that you did yourself for these books, and you credit that research at the beginning of the books with Jonathan Mitchell.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I would be curious to find out how someone like you, an artist who's very interested in science and wants to do the research, how did you find Jonathan? What was the collaboration, or how did that relationship kind of help you craft the series?
Yeah, so I mean, so in terms of research, so basically I spent a year just reading everything I could, and I wanted to get like not just in terms of the science, but just in terms of the popular science side of how we understood cavemen. So children's books with cavemen from the 50s through today, but also whatever scientific books I could find, and not a lot for kids actually available over the years. But there's like a DK book here and there, and then I would read all the way up through read the whatever the popular science books kind of written for the average layperson reader. There's been a few of those about Neanderthals that were coming out around the same time I was doing the series, and then I would read the more formal collections of research papers, which I will admit most of it was not like I was not at the level to fully appreciate. So it's like basically reading the abstract or reading the summary and kind of trying to glean as much as I could within my understanding, and some of it becomes a little dense, or honestly, like when you're reading kind of about the breakdown of all the bones found in a cave layer, and it's like this many of this species of mouse, and this many of this bat, and like this many toe bones of this kind of deer, or whatever. And it's like, okay, but I'm writing this book for kids, so I tried to understand more than I would need to know, I guess. So I tried to from the start have all the research be pretty accurate. And then actually Random House, the publisher, found Jonathan to be the vetter, and then he would read the manuscript and kind of go through and explain like, well, you're kind of right here, but technically you're wrong because of this and this. And then I would have to figure out, sometimes it was a case of figuring out how to reword something so that it was still, something kids could understand, but also something that was still, technically correct.
Did you feel like you had experience because you had experience making, I think they're called middle grade readers now. Or kids. Yeah. I want to say kids books, but that feels reductive. But did your experience in that medium with the Star Wars stuff help you kind of understand what level you needed to pitch the science at? Because that was something I was really curious about when I was reading these books. Because I'm a trained scientist and I was still learning stuff and very engaged and interested. And I was just how did you thread that needle?
I mean, it was just kind of a lot of it was just relying on my editor. So my editor is Phoebe Ye, who has been editing for lots of different age groups, but she had experience like working on the Magic School Bus series. So in terms of how to work with nonfiction research and what level of understanding kids might have, she was really helpful in that, in terms of, like I'm not sure kids will get this. And then sometimes it was just, knowing my kids and saying like, yeah, I think, like, how do I mean, there are things that I didn't understand well enough to be able to explain to an adult, let alone how to, explain it to a kid. So like maybe it's interesting, but it's not going to fit in with the book. And so it's just relying on my editor, I guess, would be the biggest part of it, and then just kind of my own instincts of what made sense. And then I also, I wanted to have it kind of both ways, where I wanted it something that kids of various ages would still be able to appreciate. Like, so, I mean, there's some kids that are younger that will understand all the science, and there's kids that are older that, they aren't going to get that side of it as much. And so I was also trying to do it in a way that the research is all kind of inserted, where you didn't need to rely on understanding everything to get the story, but then hopefully the story also helps you understand what the science is.
No, I really liked that about the format of the stories. So there are these little vignettes about this Neanderthal family and the stuff they get up to, but each vignette is kind of centered around some aspect of Neanderthal life that we understand because of research. And so, there are these two scientist characters, anthropologists or archaeologists, who will kind of butt in, and that's I think one of the beautiful things about comic storytelling is that you can, in that very Scott McCloudy way, juxtapose two very different scenes right next to each other without having to it's not a movie where you'd have to build a different set. You just draw a different scene, and you can make that switch very quickly and visually, and still keep it visually interesting and obvious what's happening. And so then the scientists will jump in and kind of explain, how do we know that this is an aspect of Neanderthal life, or to what degree, was it fictionalized in the story that the kids would have just read? And I thought that was really cool.
Yeah. I mean, so the paleontologists mostly come in the first draft. I think they were popping in constantly, and it was a little too disruptive. And so eventually, they just ended up at the ends of the chapters. Although there's little asides, within the chapters, there's usually one or two, kind of, a third of a page, with usually a little bit of information and mixed in with a joke. And then it became a great way of so it's another place where different kids can read, you could read the book and just skip the ends of the chapters with the paleontologists and go back to that later. But it also kind of makes that chapter breaks work, it works as a transition also. And yeah, I think that was another place I can credit my editor Phoebe with kind of helping figure out that format.
No, I thought it was very effective, because you just kept kind of sprinkling it in throughout, and then there's a nice little chunk at the end that kind of goes over both a little bit more of how we know what we know, but then also your process of doing the research about it. And I just thought it was cool. I thought it was well integrated, well executed, and the story itself was also compelling and good. I loved the cat character, even though the Homotherium.
Yeah.
Even though it was admittedly, that was maybe one of the biggest liberties taken, but I think your point of just cats are funny and fun to draw. So here it is.
And I mean, it's I'm a cat person, so and the humans, they get to have their, I mean, it's a wolf, but it's kind of, in the book, it's kind of more like a dog.
It's in the process.
But, and so, but then it's also a way to talk about, cats weren't domesticated till something like 10,000 years ago. And so it's, and Homotherium definitely wasn't domesticated, and definitely weren't, the size of house cats, but.
And Homotherium is a scimitar-toothed cat, for folks who aren't familiar. So it looks similar superficially to a Smilodon or a saber-toothed cat, but is a different pathway to get there evolutionarily.
Yeah.
How did you in terms of, again, making these for kids, you have to deal with things like hunting and the fact that there could be conflict when groups of Neanderthals and humans came together, and it wasn't just going to be snowball fights amongst the kids. Was that on your mind, or how did you decide how to handle some of those issues that might be a little bit more sensitive?
I mean, it's definitely, that was maybe one of the hardest parts, something that, and, there's still more research to be done, but so for example, cannibalism,
right.
I don't it didn't, I think there was a draft where I did kind of tiptoe toward talking about it, and my editor's like, she just didn't think it fit. And in the end, like, if you read between the lines, there might still be something that alludes to it. But so that was, that was one of the tougher challenges, was like, just something that I don't really talk about explicitly is, just the mortality rate. And so, but if you look at Lucy and Andy's family, it's like Lucy and Andy, and they have their mom and dad and little brother. But then there's Mr. Darrell, and there's Margaret and Phil, who are like two teenagers. And you never really like know how they're related to Lucy and Andy, or if they're related. And the unspoken story is that like their parents died, or like they're as a group because they're who didn't get killed or die from disease. And so stuff like that was a little tougher. But in the end, I decided that that's something that's something for maybe for another story or another person to tell. And so it's kind of, I think it's a lot of that's there in the background, but it didn't fit for the tones of the book.
And is Lucy named Lucy because of the Australopithecus?
Yeah, she's named after her, her great, like say great, like 2,000 times.
Yeah, you had that in the book at one point.
Like,
that was funny.
Yeah, she's definitely, and Andy was just named because like the alliteration. Lucy and Andy Neanderthal.
Yep.
Thought it was fun,
and
so,
well,
yeah.
like the word Andy is almost in Neanderthal, so it kind of works in that sense too. You mentioned a couple of museums that feature this stuff. Obviously, you're a Chicago guy, so the Field Museum is in your backyard. But did you get a chance to go to this? It looked really cool. The Neanderthal Museum in Germany.
I haven't. So
okay.
Germany is still one of the countries like I haven't been to. So all the international museums, I usually try to like, I didn't want to just keep it all centered on North America, especially
since they weren't here.
North America didn't have any Neanderthals, but just in terms of museums with natural history and evolution. So I've been to the Natural History Museum in New York and a few others on the list, but the really exciting ones, it was just like looking online and just like, oh, maybe someday, like it would have made sense to try and go when I was working on the books, but just never had the time, I guess.
Yeah. What was some of the coolest stuff you learned and were able to include? I mean, I know you kind of said you were a little Neanderthal out and it's been maybe a while since you've thought about this stuff, but yeah, what were some of the coolest things you discovered in the process of working on these books?
For me, and I don't know how much of it shows up in the books, I have a feeling not as much as I wanted to, but like for me, one of the really interesting things was just learning about the process of discovery, just how involved excavating a cave is and figuring out, when you have a cave that's, has multiple layers over the years, and then it fills with water and the layers get mixed up, and, just the mind-blowing detail you have to get into to figure out, how you're going to date things, and like just the massive amount of information that we have from really kind of so little evidence. I think that's like the thing that's still like is fascinating to me.
Have you had a chance to go to a dig, even if it's not a Neanderthal dig, but any sort of paleontological or archaeological excavation?
I haven't.
Oh, we'll have to get you out on one. That seems like this is something. I feel like this is something we can pull off. We can do this.
Yeah, I should someday. I mean, that was like another thing. Like actually, so when I was first doing the book, I was thinking about like having a book trailer, and the book trailer would just be, like a couple paleontologists on a dig, and then like they dig up the book. And I was like, oh, I could go out, like actually, like be on a dig, but unfortunately, like the books takes so much work to write. It's hard to get out of the house to do anything else.
Sure. Well, once your kids are old enough that they can come and quote unquote volunteer and help you, because dig sites are always looking for volunteers. So I think we have enough listeners who probably are involved in various field expeditions. I know one of our former guests is a curator at the Science Museum up in Minneapolis. So, and he does some field work in the area. So it's not too far. So we can probably make this happen for you.
Okay.
if you're interested in going out and getting your hands dirty.
Yeah, I could do that sometime.
Why not, right?
Yeah.
It's just digging. It's not that hard.
Yeah.
You just got to careful digging, I guess.
Yeah, I feel like as an artist who's drawing tiny pictures, I feel like I have like an attention to detail that would work still in that environment.
The precision with which you work, you'd probably be better in a prep lab than in a field excavation. But sometimes, because a lot of times what happens in the field is if we find something that's going to require a lot of detail or precision work,
right,
we'll just jacket it with a bunch of rock still around it and
right.
Take it out.
Yeah, that's one of the things. Like, so the Field Museum here in Chicago has the little room where you can actually see them working on,
the please don't feed the fossil predators, don't tap the glass sort of space.
And it's funny because like when I go with my sons and I'm like I want to go and like watch them, and they're so poor. They're like, what are we looking at? They're just taking hours to just dig away one little tiny piece of sediment or something.
You got to be careful. It takes a long time. I mean, people, I think there's a weird like fragility to these things that have still managed to survive for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of years. And so the level of care needed, and especially, and it's like, each fossil is unique, and so you don't want to damage it, especially if you're just a volunteer and you're going to get yelled at by the I used to joke, I'm not a great preparator at all by any means. I don't have I haven't put in my 10,000 hours for that skill, and so the few times I've had to be asked to do a little bit of prep work, I feel like the prep lab manager has just gotten used to whenever he sees me darken his doorway to go ahead and grab the bottle of glue because he's gonna have to put something back together that I accidentally broke. So even working scientists, need a lot of help to be good at that particular skill. It's practically its own entire subfield within paleontology. Well, it will not be an episode of Science Sort of if we didn't also talk about what we are drinking. Did Neanderthals ferment foods? There's no evidence yet, I don't think. But if they did, they might have enjoyed them more. I'm pretty sure that's how humanity got started with it. Patrick, have you fermented anything or purchased anything that was properly fermented that you might be having this time on the show?
All right. I have a Scotch. So there's a very small chain of liquor stores called, I think, Cambridge Wine Merchants. And there's one in Salisbury. And they have a Scotch that's bottled for them called Spirit of Cambridge. And it's an Islay single malt. And that's what I have. And it's very heavily peated. And so
Islay is where it comes from.
Yep.
Single malt is the number of grains, so I assume when it's single malt, is it just barley? Is that how it works? I'm still not super familiar with all the Scotch terms.
I just thought it meant it came from a single barrel. It wasn't blended together, but
wouldn't that be single barrel?
Let me.
Well, while you're doing that, I also am having Scotch. How about that?
Oh, that's fantastic. Tell me about yours. Give me the specs.
Yeah, so I'm not a Scotch guy. I'm very much a bourbon and rye and American whiskey guy. But we're living in trying times, and so you gotta branch out a little bit, try some different things. I'm not going out and stocking up as often as I used to, so I'm buying a bit more and a bit more variety. And I kind of asked the guy at my liquor store, who's gotten to know me a little bit and knows sort of what I'm interested in, and I just told him I was looking to get into a Scotch and what would be a good one to start with. And the one he recommended, he said, was his everyday kind of sipping on Scotch for when he's done with the day's work. And it is Balvenie. Is that how you say it? Balvenie?
Yeah, I think that's right. Is it the one in like a seafoam colored kind of ceramic bottle?
No, well,
no. That's a different one.
This isn't So this comes in like the little tube, right? So that's what you can hear that. So this is Balvenie Doublewood, matured in 2 distinct casks, aged 12 years. This is their 25th anniversary edition single malt Scotch whiskey. Distilled. Cool. Distillery is in Banffshire, Scotland.
Cool.
And it's aged in whiskey oak for 12 years, and then finished for 9 months in sherry oak.
Cool.
So, like I said, not a super Scotchy guy. I mean, I am often put off by the heavily peated stuff, but you know, I'm always interested in trying and learning.
I didn't. I certainly started. Yeah, I'm not. I just decided if I was going to be here, I might as well like try to learn something about it. So yeah, definitely started with the sweeter stuff, and then have kind of transitioned into some more some stuff with a little more peat.
Yeah, I mean, the stuff I'm having is exceptionally smooth, very drinkable. I'm not getting a ton of smoke at all, almost, to the point where, like, I think when I go on my next run, I'll probably tell him, like, this was an excellent whiskey. I really, really enjoyed it, but, like, I want to go a little more aggressive, you know, sort of like when you're, like, this analogy will probably work for 2 people, but whatever. Like, when you first start rock climbing, you know, you get, like, some pretty comfortable, flat-footed rock climbing shoes, and then as you get a little bit more into it, you're like, no, I want something more aggressive, like, I want to cram my foot into, like, a tiny little hook claw thing, and... Yeah, so I think I'm ready to go to that next step of aggressiveness with Scotch.
So single malt just means from a single distillery, apparently.
Really?
Yeah.
That's a weird thing to point out.
It's the UK's Scotch whiskey regulations say that single malt Scotch whiskey must be made exclusively from malted barley.
So I was right. So it is a single grain.
Yeah, right. In the US, sometimes it's malted rye rather than malted barley.
And malted just means that they let it germinate, right? Sorry, am I driving you insane? My understanding is that you need it to germinate so that it'll start producing sugars that you can then ferment. Because if it hasn't
This is correct. You are correct.
If it hasn't germinated, then it would still just be starches, and I don't think the yeast can work with the starch. So you have to have sugar. So I guess I do know some things.
Yep, me too. So yeah, man. So cheers, Scotch, yum yum, Scotchy Scotch.
And speaking of Scotch, eggs, which are a food from Scotland that look a little bit like a spaceship pod. No, that doesn't make any sense. What am I doing?
We gotta go to space now. Is what we're doing?
Yeah, we gotta talk about Jeffrey Brown's sci-fi book. You know, they drink Scotch in the Expanse books.
Oh, yeah, is that what they call it? Do they call it something else, or they call it Scotch?
Well, there is a scene in one of the Expanse books where they've just completed a job and made a good bit of money, and so they're actually they're on the moon, but they're actually able to afford a bottle of real Scotch from Scotland. And so, like, that's like the you know, they really went all out and paid this exorbitant crazy amount, but and most of the time they're drinking stuff that's fermented up in space, because a lot of the food that's been developed that can be made in space is like yeast and fungal, you know, mushroom byproduct type stuff. So the people who live in space and have lived up there for generations are really good distillers and brewers because of that, which is kind of a cool little, I don't know, that was kind of a cool cultural note, fleshing out the world. But Jeffrey Brown's comics are for kids, so not a lot of talk of fermenting booze, but a lot of other fun sci-fi talk, and that's what we talk about in the second half of our interview. And here it is. Well, I think people should definitely check out those books. I really enjoyed them, but you have a new book coming out, and I want to make sure we spend a little bit of time discussing that. Once Upon a Spacetime, which will be available this June. And you've decided you did your Flintstones, so now I guess you're doing your Jetsons. Is that sort of the fair comparison?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of, I guess probably more Star Trek than Jetsons, but the basic premise is two human kids from Earth, and Earth has first contact with this alien named Toby, and Toby is going to take these two human kids on like a mission to explore the galaxy, and they meet some alien kids that are also on this mission and end up on a spaceship full of robots, and then they head off into the universe. So book one is kind of a lot of just the two main characters, Jide and Petra, just kind of training and getting off the planet, I guess.
Yeah, and so are you a Star Trek guy? Because I mean, it's hard not to associate you with Star Wars, given your body of work.
I mean, I'm definitely more Star Wars than Star Trek, but I mean, I like, especially the original series. I liked Next Generation, and I watched Deep Space Nine when it was first coming out. But the original series, especially, like I used to watch those reruns all the time. Like, they'd be on like my late night watching, like all through like middle school and high school. I even back then I would stay up late, and there'd be, it was like MASH, Taxi, and Star Trek, basically. And so for this series, like just the idea of what's the vehicle for getting kids out into space, and I knew I didn't want to have the kind of heavy research that I had with the Neanderthal series, but I'm still like, I've always really been interested in space science, and so like stuff pops in there, but it's way, I don't want to say diluted, but it's way less scientifically accurate. And even in the places where like sometimes the kids will talk about different ideas about, whether it's what it takes to actually for a rocket to escape Earth's gravity, like there's always like a little bit of
I mean, you're I feel like you're selling yourself a little short for a guy who made a kid's book that includes Goddard's rocket equation. So, and not just the concept, you included the actual mathematical equation. So I think you're not giving yourself enough credit, I'll say, for the science content you did. I mean, you have orbital slingshotting, you've got space elevators, you've got a lot of stuff in here.
Yeah, well, I think so. One of the things that's like, so some of the books that I really like in terms of for these books, the science reading that really is like the background to it is, I love Richard Feynman's books, Stephen Hawking's stuff, Kip Thorne's book on black holes. I remember reading, and then Lawrence Krauss's, he did the physics of Star Trek, and that book was kind of a good entry point for me into kind of making the leap of actual science to what we might see in movies and things, and beyond like the specific examples that he might investigate in his books with Star Trek, but thinking about like, when I'm watching whatever, like what was the Passengers with
with Chris Pratt and Jennifer Lawrence?
Yeah,
that was not a good movie.
Like, but I mean, like, just thinking about like the science that's underneath that or isn't underneath it.
Are you an Expanse guy? Have you got any of the Expanse?
It's on my list, and I haven't. So
I'm all about the books. I know a lot of people really love the show, and I watched the show. I've seen every episode of the show, and I know it's hipsterish to say that the books were better, but the books I love the books, and I think you would need a Star Wars sized budget to do justice to them, and the show just can't quite get there for me.
Well, maybe I should check out the books, because that might have been part of the reason that I started watching, and then, but it's also like watching anything for me that I haven't seen a million times. So like I can rewatch Star Wars while I'm working on something.
Exactly, because you don't have to. Yeah,
it's like background music.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean,
although I'll tell you one weird fun fact about the Expanse show. The lead actor, the guy who plays Jim Holden, his aunt is a paleontologist.
There you go.
And I know her, so there's our paleo connection.
Yeah, I think, yeah, for me, like as much as the Neanderthal books were about like how can I take something interesting like that like was fun to learn about, like making stone tools, and put that into a story. And for this, it's more kind of maybe going the other way, and like what science would be interesting to think about when this is happening in the story. And I think like Star Trek, like one of the reasons I would compare the book to Star Trek is, for me, Star Trek, like there's always that little bit of real scientific theory that's being referenced, or is maybe inspiring things in the show. And that is one of the things that like gets me interested in learning about like the actual science of those whatever astrophysical phenomena we might be seeing.
I think one of the coolest things that I've heard from a number of artists, artists, authors, and scientists is this amazing loop, like this Ouroboros that happens where people, creative people get inspired, and not to say that any one group is more creative than the other, but like creative people who are producing creative works get inspired by some real kind of science or something, and then they go create this like more fantastical version of it. And then I know so many scientists who were inspired by the fantastical version of the thing to go then do science and push the science forward. And I think that relationship hasn't really been fully explored or isn't given enough credit. I think it's really cool.
Yeah. I mean, like I still love, so Carl Sagan is another like favorite, and I love in Contact when Ellie says she's traveling and she's like, they should have sent a poet.
Mm-hmm.
Like that idea of, I always had this idea that sciences and art have kind of the same purpose, which is about understanding life. And science does it objectively and art does it subjectively. And like when those two things intersect, I don't know, it's just, I think it can be really interesting and satisfying.
And I just like how they feed off of each other. Like I like how one can inspire the other and vice versa. Like one of the professors I had in undergrad has said that like he wanted to become a scientist because of X-Men comics, and he's like, I want to find mutants and become my own Professor X and have my team of mutants to go. And so like I just and I hear that over and over again from the scientists that I know, and I know so many artists and creative people who really have a strong appreciation for science, and I love that relationship exists.
Yeah.
So in developing this story, is it sort of mandatory that the main characters are kids in this level of fiction for the age range you're going for?
Yeah, it kind of is. And, it's something actually, because I have because I'm always getting ahead of myself and I have way more ideas than I can keep up with. But like the next story I don't want to have the main characters be kids. But then I was thinking, maybe that's for an older age of reader. But I don't know. Yeah, I think it is. But I think that generally, like middle grade books, like the main characters are kids. Sometimes of vague age, because you want, like, younger kids actually want to read about older kids.
I remember noticing this when I was a kid, that like the toy commercials for toys that were clearly pitched at me at my age always had kids that looked, 1 unit of kid age older than me. Yeah. And I think I think that's exactly what they were doing, is they were trying to like make it look like, to me, a younger kid. Like if I'm 7, they're like, oh, this is the kid that this is the toy that the 10-year-olds play with. And I'd be like, oh, cool.
But and then at the same time, you like, there's also like, you want to see kids your age. And so it's like trying to navigate that can be kind of like I don't know if I even know exactly how old G-Day and Petra are in the Spacetime series. Like they're middle grade. Like they could be 6th grade, they could be 9th grade. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I should say that both of these series are pitched for ages 8 to 12, because I know we have a fair number of parents and even some kids who listen to the show. So that's the age range that you're aiming for. And G-Day and Petra are a super fun character. I really enjoyed the whole cast of characters. I thought Toby was hilarious. Is it Commander G?
Yep.
Yeah. He was great, always wearing the sunglasses, even in space.
Yeah.
I just had a lot of fun with it. I mean, and you know, you wear a lot of your inspiration on your sleeve. I feel like there's a lot. I mean, you even referenced the right stuff. There's a lot of the right stuff. There's a lot of Star Trek. There's a lot of
Yeah.
maybe
I mean,
some of the Mars fiction that exists that you're referencing.
I mean, there's like, so, like, yeah, I'm, Star Wars has been the bulk of my career for the past little while, but in terms of science fiction, like I grew up reading, like, I mean, I mentioned all the kind of the science side of things, but also just in terms of science fiction reading, like I've always been a big science fiction reader. Like right now, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this right, but I love Xijin Liu's Three Body Problem.
I haven't checked that out yet. I think I might need to read those while I'm waiting for the next Expanse book.
Yeah, I absolutely love them. There's so much hard science in them, and then there's also just the kind of really like deep thought kind of science theory kind of underneath things, but then there's also like all the human elements, and so I really enjoyed that series, and actually the other books he's had out too. I've been eating up. I haven't read the newest one yet, but so yeah, I mean, I think like all that stuff seeps in, and like yeah, whenever there's an opportunity to make like a specific reference, so like yeah, there's the classic right stuff walking to the
Yep.
Like kind of echoing that image, and yeah, I'm sure there's lots of other things that are ending up in there that I'm not even aware of.
My wife has still never seen The Right Stuff, but it's a movie my dad and I love and quote at each other all the time, and it's become so prevalent in sort of our inside joke, that weird kind of dialogue that you develop with people you're close with, where like half of what you say is just a reference to something else. And so now my wife fully knows that when there's like an awkward moment of silence, to just go, okay, you can be Gus. Because I got an advanced reader copy of this, I was able to see some of the still being finalized artwork, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about your comics process, since you are a writer artist. I would call you a cartoonist. I don't know if that's a label you would give yourself, and I think that's not disparaging. I think cartooning is
that's usually. I mean, sometimes it depends on who I'm talking to and how I want to impress them. How I define myself, like yes, I'm an author.
Or a graphic novelist.
I'm an artist, graphic novelist. But yeah, cartoonist is kind of actually makes the most sense. And yeah, so for process, like I think one of the questions that people ask a lot is, what comes first, the writing or the drawing? And for me, it's always the writing first, but the drawing is part of the writing. So my process is usually like a first draft that's kind of stick figures. Although actually before that, there's, 8 million versions of an outline that gets more and more refined and detailed until I have kind of like a page by page outline.
And that outline is just text?
That one's just text, but it's always handwritten until I'm sending it to my editor.
Interesting.
Because I find that, so if I have it as a text document and I'm just going to change one thing, I'm only kind of paying attention to that one sequence. But if I have to rewrite the whole story, I'm kind of I'm replaying the whole story in my head as I go through the outlines. And so it helps, I think, keep the big picture in view in a way that it wouldn't if I was just typing it. Yeah, so I handwrite the outline, handwrite it, then type it up and send it to my editor, and then might make a few adjustments, and then I re-handwrite it for the next stage. And then the first draft they're kind of not quite stick figures, so there's like little details to differentiate characters, and sometimes there's more detail, but just to get the basics of the story and the pacing. And then there's a second draft after that, so the advanced copy that you have of Spacetime, I think it's like the last little section is the second draft, where it's more detailed. It's drawn kind of at the size that'll be drawn at for the final artwork. And the dialogue's a little more final, a lot of times in the stick figure draft, the first draft, I'll have places where instead of spending all my time trying to like think of the perfect joke for a moment, I'll just do a bad joke, or sometimes I'll just put in parentheses joke. Like instead of, just so I can like keep moving instead of, spending 3 days like, what is the right joke? Because a lot of times that joke just comes in the middle of the night later on unexpectedly. But by the second draft, like pretty much final, like I'll still add little details or things that I think of as I go in the final artwork. But so it's kind of a 4-stage process for outline, then like a thumbnail stick figure draft, then kind of a more fully drawn rough draft, and then the final artwork.
And is that always how you've made your comics? At least once you've started making them professionally? I know you said you've been drawing since you were a kid.
So because like the autobiographical work that I started out doing in comics was all drawn directly in ink, and I would kind of have like a rough idea of stories, but then I would just go straight in ink. And when I started doing the Jedi Academy books, those are a lot more involved editorially than anything I'd done before, in terms of not only having an editor at Scholastic, but then Lucasfilm also going through everything. And so those I ended up doing a rough draft, but it wasn't a stick figure draft. It was kind of like a fully drawn rough draft. And that's what I tried to do when I started Lucy and Andy. But Lucy and Andy was so much more complex with all the science, and the world building was more involved because, with Jedi Academy, even though like most of the characters I'm coming up with and like they're all new except for Yoda, like the rules of that world were kind of established. And so I didn't have to think about it as much. And even though Lucy and Andy was set in the real world, ostensibly, like there's still a lot of work because I kind of had to figure out how I'm going to decide what the world 40,000 years ago was like in a way that could be right for this kid's book. And yeah, so it was just way too complicated. And so that for the first Lucy and Andy book, I actually did like a kind of a more fully drawn rough draft. And then I did the next draft with stick figures because there was so much rewriting. And then I did the kind of fully drawn third draft. And then since then I've kind of settled on like, okay, stick figures for the first draft.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I mean, I asked because, when you're the writer artist, because a lot of times, we're a science podcast, not a comics podcast, but I talk about comics a lot. But for those who don't know, if you have a separate writer and a separate artist, the writer, unless they're working in the quote unquote Marvel style, which basically nobody does anymore, the writer will write a full script that includes page and panel breakdowns and script balloons, right. And then the artist will draw it, and then maybe it'll get inked. Inking is kind of a dying art, and then you add colors and the word balloons and the text and all that stuff. And it looks like your stuff is also still hand lettered.
Yeah, and which is for better or worse. I think, for me, I think comics, like the handwriting is part of the style of art. It's part of the voice of the books. And there's been times where the publishers like asked, do you want us to have a letterer? And then I'm like, no, I mean, I know it's a lot more work, but it doesn't feel right. And so I've come to embrace that.
I mean, the word balloon seems so integrated into your style, and I imagine I imagine your brain now designs panel and page layouts with the word balloon placement in mind. So it'd probably be really frustrating to have somebody else do it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know like how anyone works like the old Marvel style of just you draw the page and you kind of leave a little room, and then like whoever's writing has to figure out how to fit. I mean, I guess that's a different kind of challenge, and like anything, you do it enough, you get better at it. But yeah, for me, it's just I have trouble composing without like the composition of the page or the panels doesn't make sense without knowing what kind of, at least generally, where the word balloons are going to go, and all the way down to the final art.
Yeah, I guess I should clarify what Marvel style is, and it's back in the day. Marvel was had just finally started making some books that were hits, like the Fantastic Four, and Stan Lee was having to basically write everything every month, but he had a bunch of artists that he would work with. So he would just go into the bullpen, the infamous Marvel bullpen, and would just like talk to Jack Kirby and be like, Jack Kirby, this week or this month, the Fantastic Four fight God. Draw the comic. I'll add the words when you're done drawing it. and then Jack Kirby's like, okay. And then he draws this giant figure with a G. And then, Stan Lee's like, all right, we'll call him Galactus. And Reed's going to say this. And then the letter would, add the letters after the fact over the art. And a surprising amount of like some of the, more fundamental parts of how we think about modern comics came because of this really weird, kinetic, not that efficient, seemingly a lot more work for the artist style of doing things.
Yeah.
So that's cool. That I think I still really appreciate hand lettering. I think it's, I hope it doesn't ever completely go away. I realize that when you're producing comics every month for a big corporation, it makes sense to shop that out to somebody who can do it digitally. Yeah. But I think it really adds it makes these a little more special, I think.
Yeah.
You've been very generous with your time. I only have a couple more questions. One, I meant to ask this while we were talking about Lucy and Andy, but what's the response been like? Have you heard from kids and parents about these books and what they've learned from them?
Yeah, I mean the response has been great. Kids really love the science of it, and I hear from a lot of teachers that really appreciate that. So my dream is that someday, like in 15, 20 years, I'll get a letter from a kid who's like, I read your book when I was in middle school. Now I'm like a paleontologist. Like that's kind of my one dream. So I still have to wait for that one. But the response has been great. Yeah, I think there are more science comics now. There's a whole science comic series. There's Jim Ottavani, who has been doing science-related comics for a long time.
Yeah, do you know him? Can you help me get him on the show? I've wanted to talk to him for a while too. Yeah, we should probably do this off air, but I'm just going to ask you while we're recording.
Yeah,
I would love to talk to him.
I think I still have his most current email. I'll try to hook you up.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a thirst for science in comics, and there's a place for it. And so the response to Lucy Andy has been great. And like one of the tough things is, so I did the 3 books, and I was like, okay, that was an awful lot of research, and I was ready for a break from that. Although I was really starting to love the characters in a way where I was in a really good groove with them. But I felt like so much of what I'd covered, I was like, well, I don't know how much research is out there to sustain a whole nother book, let alone like to keep going. I packed too much into the first 3 books. But people are always asking, is there going to be a 4th Lucy and Andy? And I don't have any plans for it. But in the back of the Spacetime books, there's going to be a new short story with Lucy and Andy. So in the first book, the science side of it is about boats. It's about the earliest boats that they've found and when we think people started using boats. And so I'm still kind of keeping up with the characters.
Oh, that's really cool. I was wondering if you were gonna ever do like a Jetsons Flintstone style crossover between the 2 worlds. But,
no. Yeah, I don't want to give any spoilers. There is like the possibility that there'll be like some kind of Lucy and Andy reference pop up in Spacetime. We'll see. But,
exciting.
But I don't think it definitely won't be like here's Jide and Petra meeting them in the Stone Age or something. It's not going to be that. But
Toby has made it clear multiple times that he does not have the ability to teleport or travel through time.
Yeah.
Toby's the more advanced alien
in book 1.
Well, so, sure. I know that was something I was going to say is I was going to ask you what's coming next, but at the end of the first volume of Spacetime is a sketch of the cover for Spacetime Book 2, a complete waste of Spacetime.
Yeah. Now known as a total waste of Spacetime.
There's been updates.
For the typography, like we had to shorten the title. But so I actually just finished the first draft of Book 2 a few weeks ago, or maybe a month ago. It's all a blur, but I'm just went over all the notes with my editor, so getting kind of digesting those and making notes on my editor's notes to get ready to write the second draft of book 2. So
awesome. Well, that's really exciting.
So that would theoretically come out June of next year.
And then I guess this is my last question. It's a little bit more of a heady, esoteric question maybe. But, you were talking about, I was thinking about this when you were talking about trying to read scientific articles to do the research for Lucy and Andy, and how a lot of times they were written in such a way where you could maybe read some of the abstract and look at some of the figures. Is there something scientists could learn from comics and graphic storytelling that you think could help us be better at communicating what we know about the world?
That's an interesting thought. Yes, probably. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, part of it is it's just what audience you're writing for. It's like the same way that writing a research paper for your peers needs to be written differently than writing something for someone who has zero experience with what you're talking about. So, but I think like the thing about comics that's really effective is delivering multiple layers of information at the same time. So you're getting the text and you're getting the image, and the image isn't always just an illustration of what the text says. The image can be something different. So that kind of mechanic of kind of being able to layer different levels of meaning at the same time, I don't know, maybe there's something there.
No, I think that's really interesting. Yeah, I like that. I like that idea a lot, for sure. I find that often when I'm working on, so when you go to a scientific conference, you usually get the option to present your work as a talk using PowerPoint, or a poster where you stand at the poster for a couple hours and people come up and ask questions.
Uh-huh.
And I think so much of effective poster design comes down to thinking about it as panel layout.
Yeah.
And so when I'm working with my lab group or whatever, and I'm trying to get feedback on how they've laid out their poster, I'm often describing things in terms of thinking of it as a page of comics, and how does the eye move from panel to panel, and what does the gutter represent in terms of the transition that you're making when you jump from the introduction to the methods or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I think how we read things. So, I mean, coming from a fine art background too, like we talk about reading, how you read a painting, and it's just there's things you do visually that lead the eye around, that give indicators to the reader, like how they're supposed to take in the information. And in comics, it's more there's a narrative aspect where you're supposed to read this, then this, and then this. And I would think with posters, there's probably more opportunity where it doesn't have to be so ABC necessarily, but there's ways to connect information besides chronologically or.
Yeah, the challenge with posters is posters are usually laid out the same as a research paper.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's always the balance of text to visuals, which is also similar to thinking about a comic page. I think one of the biggest mistakes I often see, I guess mistake is maybe not the right word, but one of the biggest issues I see, issues isn't the wrong word either, because that's got a different context for comics. But a trend I've noticed in the time I've spent working with websites like iFanboy and doing their podcast is new writers to comics tend to overwrite and give the artist less to do. And so they usually write these really text-heavy first issues.
Mm-hmm.
Like even Ta-Nehisi Coates, like some of his early Black Panther scripts were so wordy that it was actually kind of hard to get through, and he's a great writer. And so with scientific posters, it's like this balance between having enough text that hopefully somebody could walk up even when you're not there and know what the poster's about, but not so text-heavy that it feels like you have to stand there and read it as if it was an entire research paper. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a balance to it, and that's a lot of that's editing. It's just what is the essential information. One of the things that
well, that's something academics struggle with, because if you ask us what the essential information is, we say, well, all of it. You need everything.
Yeah, I mean, I ran into that with especially the at the end of each chapter in Lucy and Andy, there's usually it's 1 or 2 pages of the paleontologist, but at the end of each book there's like a 20-page section where it's kind of a lot more information. And for those sections, a lot of that was, I always had way more in there than is in the final book, because my editor she'd go through and would like sometimes she would suggest rewording something, for brevity, and then I'd be like, well, I can't really change it that way, because that changes what the meaning is, so that's no longer correct.
Yeah.
But so sometimes it was a challenge of like, well, how can I say this paragraph in one sentence? So it's really, there's an art to that, that I think it's hard for any writer, but I think especially in terms of science, where, it's like mathematics, like you move the decimal point one place, it changes everything. So it's tough to figure out, how you can reduce and still have it be what it needs to be.
Yeah, I know as a science communicator myself, one of the things I struggle with the most, and people who are listening to this, who've listened to me for years on this podcast, are probably going to roll their eyes, but I have a hard time getting to the point. Like, because I want to provide all the background necessary. Like, no.
Yeah.
Like, to understand my point, you need, this short course of of stuff that I think is important. But no, just get to the point. Well, speaking of getting to the point, thank you so much for joining me. Where obviously people can find your stuff wherever books or comics are sold, but where else can people find you out in the wide world of the internet and learn more about the work you're up to?
Yeah. So my website is jeffreybrowncomics.com, and that should give you a general overview.
And we'll link to that in the show notes for this episode. Yeah.
And then I guess the only other place I'm really on, like, I try to avoid social media for the most part, but I started posting on Instagram. And so it's a mix of basically pictures of my cat.
Excellent.
And then occasionally things that I'm working on. So sometimes a little bit of insight into process, although it's tough because, especially with anything with like Star Wars, I can't post really, because they're like, no, you can't post that until after. So, but I try to give a little bit of insight into working process on there too.
And what's your handle on Instagram for if people want to follow you?
And that is at Jeffrey Brown RQ.
Cool. Well, thank you so much again for joining us. I've been looking forward to talking to you for a while, and glad we were finally able to make it happen.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Plink plonk. So was my chat with Jeffrey Brown. Long overdue. Very glad we were able to work it out, and I had a lot of fun talking to him. Obviously, I am a person who likes talking about science and comics, and anytime I can meld those two together, I'm in my happy place. So I had a lot of fun with that interview. Hopefully you all enjoyed it too. Patrick, what did you think? You just sat here and listened to the whole thing.
Yeah, a lot of fun. I've got some reading to do now that I've heard all about the fun world of Sciencey Kids comics.
Yeah. And, Patrick, if you have any feedback for me on the interview and you wanted to share that, you could send it in to my email address, which you have, or the contact page at sciencesword.com. And then if it was feedback that I felt strongly about, I would maybe feature it in our next and final segment, which is the PaleoPOW. The PaleoPOWs is the final segment of the show where we talk about feedback that we've received from all you lovely people out there. We got an email from Crue T, which I believe we read a iTunes review from Crue on a recent episode because I thought that was a really cool name. But if not, and then we got two Crues out there, and that's great too. If yes, then sometimes people get a little double dip, little twice feedback if you send in two pieces of good feedback. Hello, my name is Crue T, and I've been watching the show since about episode 200-ish. Watching. So somebody, I didn't think I had my webcam turned on. And it is my favorite way to drive home and to work. Driving in general. Oh, sorry, Patrick. This guy's a driver. You know how you feel about that?
If he lives in North America, he doesn't have much choice.
I love the show so much where I've decided that when I go back to school, I want to pursue an earth science degree of some kind. I'm very excited, except I have no idea the degree I want to go into. I'm torn and have been since high school. I love science. Since I was little, everything science was my love. Chemistry in high school was a breeze and was so fun. So was agricultural science and all my other science classes. I love the study of fossils and animals, so I've always thought about pursuing paleontology would be a blast, except I also really love anthropology and geology and ecology and sustainability, which you wrote in all caps. I can't make up my mind for the life of me. I feel like I love all those topics equally, but I cannot choose. Whenever you guys talk about dinosaurs and fossils, I beam. Same with old cultures and sloths and different animals. In the end, I want the kind of job where I do tons of research because I love research and long-winded papers about something I'm passionate about. You've talked about finding your passion in science before. However, how do you find your passion in science when everything in science feels like my passion? Thanks for reading this, and thanks for your show. I'm seriously obsessed. Thanks a ton. Sincerely, Crue. All right, Patrick, tall order. Let's sort this person's life out.
Man, I don't know how you find your passion exactly. And it is tough. I feel like I run a series of middle distance races where I'm like really into something for a while, and then you kind of like reach saturation point and you grab another thing and you run with that for a while. I think I've said it on this show before though, and I'll say it again. Is that the thing you do that most other people are not doing in whatever you study is going to be the key to your career. So, if you're go get an earth science degree, it's going to be that class or two you took in genetics or in special relativity that's going to really shape you down the road that you didn't realize yet, because all the other folks you went to get that earth science degree with got all the same classes you did, except for these one or two weird things that you took. And those are going to shape your thinking and shape your career in ways that you never saw coming. So pay attention in those other classes.
I also feel like the hesitancy to specialize early on in a scientific career, I think is pretty common. I think many of us have a broad interest and want to look at a lot of different things, and it can be hard to hyper specialize to the point that it actually takes to get a degree and start writing papers. If we're talking about an advanced degree, I'm not sure if we're talking about an undergrad degree or an advanced degree. I think sometimes you have to, or at least for me in my career so far, I've had to accept that I'm going to be a specialist in the thing that I focus on, and I'll probably mostly publish papers in that kind of area, but I can still be interested in other kinds of science while doing that. But the science I produce is probably going to be a little bit limited based on, there's only so many hours in the day and there's only so many things I, as one person, can study. And for me, people often ask, how'd you get into sloths? Because sloths have become such a popular thing on the internet. And the true answer is my master's advisor had an idea for a project and kind of pitched it to me. And I said, yeah, that sounds good. And I started working on it, and I realized that I had a lot of questions about sloths. And once, I feel like the biggest transition that I had going from undergrad to graduate school was realizing that once you start working on a project and start learning to solve problems scientifically with the methods that are available to you because of the funding you have or the lab that you work in or whatever, then your brain kind of kicks over into this mode of like, you start thinking in terms of, is this a question I can answer in a way that will generate a research paper? And not even in like a callous, like high impact factor, but just like, is this a unit of thing that I can work on in a way that makes sense and get something useful out of? And transitioning from just being broadly interested in all science, which I still am, to more the career aspect of how do I actually solve the problem at hand at the moment, and how do I then leverage that into figuring out what the next problem I want to go after is. So I think you almost don't have to decide. It can be decided for you at a certain point if you just end up working in a lab and the lab has a project that they need somebody to work on, and you just never know what rabbit hole that might send you down, I think.
And I guess I'll throw in another thread here that says, you may find out after a degree or two that, a research career is not what you thought it was going to be, or it's not cracked up the way you thought it was going to. And I don't think there's no shame in that. The world has need for scientific thinking in all walks of life. So your your degree and the way you've trained your mind will be useful no matter what you branch into after that.
I also think the friends of mine who struggled with this same problem and decided to tackle it a couple of different ways, like a number of them have become journalists. You get to, depending on the outlet you write for, you might still get to write stories about geology, ecology, sustainability, chemistry. Like if you're writing for an outlet that covers those topics, they might need people writing stories about that all the time. My wife works in a museum and she works on usually a couple exhibits at a time, but like it still gives her a much broader set of things to research than I would if I was only focused on my science projects that I'm actively pursuing and trying to get published. I would be working in a more narrow space than she gets to work in because, the museum has exhibits about all different kinds of things. So there are definitely other ways of engaging with science where you're not necessarily generating the data and the research paper, but you do get to retain that sort of more diversified portfolio. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that's part of the origin story of this podcast. I was reaching the stage in my career where you just got more and more thinking about this less and less broad topic. And I was like, I need to think about some other things.
And for me, I think the best way to start that narrowing, winnowing process down, at least to the point of getting a degree, is getting back to what Patrick said initially. Find that class that sparked something in you and go talk to that professor and develop a relationship and find out if that professor has a space in their lab or their research group for somebody who's interested in learning more, and see if you can get your hands on a project. Like, I think the sooner young scientists get their hands on an actual project where they are generating data or they're working with data or they're helping a grad student generate data, that's where you start, I think, refining, okay, is working on projects using this set of methods or within the context of what this lab has access to, something that I am still enjoying and still am finding passion in. Because if you're truly passionate about all these different things, like the type of science you choose to specialize in almost doesn't matter because you just need to get the work done, I think. Yeah. And there's definitely an increasing call for big multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary collaborations, but you still need to make sure that you have a role to play in that as a person with a specific discipline. So maybe you are really interested in, sustainability, but you might need to work with a geologist on a sustainability project. And so I think it's hard to be the expert in both, but if you can just commit to being the expert in one, as long as you are still finding passion and joy in that, and you still might get the opportunity to work within those other fields and still get that, scratch that itch.
Yeah. But yeah, it's hard. A lot of people know a little bit about a lot of things, and not that many people know all there is to know about something specific. So, but increasingly you've got to be able to bridge those disciplines. So there's no right answer, and I don't think there's anyone who can tell you how to outline a career. You kind of just have to feel your way through it and chase the things that are interesting you as they come.
Yep. So I don't know if that helps, but hopefully it does. And good luck. And please follow up if you end up deciding, this is the degree I'm going for, just reading your list of things. It sounds like environmental geology might be a good place to start because that environmental geology can include a little bit of ecology and chemistry and sustainability. I don't know how you get the anthro in there, but environmental geology is one of the degrees I have that got me into paleo. So I'll just go ahead and promote geology because geology is great. And I work for the Geological Society of America, but this is not a paid endorsement of geology as a topic.
It is a pretty great sort of science major.
It's the whole Earth.
Yeah.
Earth science. You get the whole Earth. Like you talk about dinosaurs, this is on the Earth right there. Old cultures, Earth. Different animals, Earth.
I do feel like it's where all the sciences intersect at some point in your geology coursework.
Yeah, you can be a geochemist, you can be a geophysicist, you can be a paleoecologist, which is like a geology ecologist, You can be a paleoanthropologist. So we did it, Patrick. We were trying to tell him to find his passion and just explore around, but instead we're just going to say, get a degree in geology.
Yeah.
Oh boy, this is why we didn't become guidance counselors and just became podcasters instead.
Yeah.
We did also become thesis maker-uppers.
All right.
Patrick, how does one go about getting a fake thesis from us? What is the process?
Well, you have to pay your tuition to the Patreon office of further studies.
The registrar.
Yeah. And at the Avogadro's Army level or higher, which you pay, it makes it sound really sort of money grubbing. But anyway, pay a visit to the bursar's office there at Patreon and sign up for the Avogadro's Army level and or higher, and we will decide on your course of study.
Much like we did for Crue.
That's right.
Well, who do we have on the docket? Who's up for their defense this episode?
We have Amy H, and she has a post for us to read as well. She says, so this is through Patreon. She says, "Greetings, PaleoPOWs. Our family has finally managed to support you on Patreon. We've been listening for many years, starting back in 2011, when I was training for a marathon and needed something entertaining for my miles of running." See, that's how you do it, Ryan. You don't need a car. Just run for miles till you get to your job or wherever else.
What about? I mean, but I don't want to be all sweaty.
Right. Well, she also listens to it whenever she's on her family road trips.
Oh, probably in a car.
So, well, it doesn't say that.
RV, you
so
think?
I envision them all just running for miles and miles. Well,
no, I'm gonna go with wagon train.
all right.
Go horse-drawn wagon train, oxen drawn.
So she goes on to say, and our kids, one of whom is Zoe Sparkles, have loved it since they were little. We all love science, and we love your show because it has different interesting topics. Thank you for the years of entertainment. Amy, thank you so much for supporting us, and thank you for that message. It always means a lot to hear from us, and we're humbled when we hear that entire families and kids are listening to the show. And I think this was a great episode for this piece of feedback, since it was such a sort of family-focused episode. So, Ryan, what do you think? I was thinking along the lines of including some, maybe acknowledging the family effort here. Maybe we need to include some sparkles.
I mean, there's like the idea of the if we're talking about like Neanderthals and early humans, there's the whole pursuit hypothesis, the endurance hunting, right?
Oh, endurance hunting. I was thinking along the lines of sort of early art, like cave art, and maybe the use of glitter. First use of glitter in Neanderthal.
Yeah, keep going. I'm liking this.
First use of glitter in Neanderthal cave art. A depiction of a family setting in. I don't know. Help me round that out.
Yeah. This is great. I'm just typing because sometimes I have to like type to get the nonsense science to come out. In Paleolithic art, from where should this cave have been from? That's
Germany.
Sure.
Let's see. Maltreviso Cave?
I was gonna call it Brown's Cave for Jeffrey Brown.
All right, Brown's Cave. Go for it.
But I'm spelling it the English spelling. So
with an E on the end?
Oh, I meant like the American English, like the way he actually spells his name.
Oh. Let's make it Gorge. Brown's Gorge. For some reason, I feel like that's more.
Okay, so how about this? Spotting sparkles, first evidence of glitter use in familial Paleolithic art from Brown's Gorge, Germany.
Oh, congratulations on your degree, Amy and family.
Spotting sparkles.
Dun, 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 dun.
Please,
tears.
You gotta
wipe away a tear.
Flip the tassel.
Yep.
Or do they get hooded? No, because I think we did figure out that these are undergraduate theses.
Okay.
Because it's for your BSso.
That's right. Like good family effort on this one. If you're reading the acknowledgments, can see them all acknowledging each other and how important they were. They never would have made it through those late nights if it hadn't been for the other members of the family.
Lovely sentiment. Lovely sentiment. All right. Well, if you would like to get your name inscribed on the list of patrons, which we do actually have maintained by our buddy Thomas over on the website. If you go to the support the show section, you can see a list of our beloved patrons, which is another one of the things you get when you become a patron. So that's one way to support the show. Another way to support the show is if you only want to give a one-time donation, you can do that at PayPal. And you can also leave us a review on iTunes, which is free, but helps people find the show, especially when the review is nice to us. Yeah. And if you want to get in touch with us, there's a contact page on the website, or PaleoPOWs at scienceorder.com. The website is scienceorder.com. The show notes for this episode will be there. Go check out Jeffrey's books. If you have a local bookseller that is, offering curbside pickup or something like that, and you can support them that way, or a comic shop. I know a lot of comic shops are hurting. Do you know they've just stopped shipping comics, Patrick?
I mean, I read an article about somebody was going to start shipping comics again. Maybe it's DC, and they were just going to upcycle their digital content, which was many people were upset by.
Well, yeah, because the local comic shop ecosystem is such a strange artifact of a weird single distributor system specialty shop for a limited for like a product that doesn't have huge market penetration. It's a mess.
Kind of like newspapers.
I mean, but you used to be able to at least get comics on the newsstands. You can't even do that anymore.
Right.
So, go buy some comics. Buy Jeffrey Brown's comics. Buy all the comics. Great comics. What did I read recently? I reread Robin Year One. It was great. It's because the iFanboy guys were talking about it. They've basically shifted to a graphic novel a week format, and comics are good, Patrick. That's what I have to say. And if you agree that comics are good, or if you disagree that comics are bad, write in. I want that hot take. If you write in, you may get featured on another episode. And that's it for this episode, though. Have we recorded one after this? We haven't, so I can't give a sneak preview because I don't know what's coming next.
Could be anything.
What would you like to see next, Patrick? Just toss something out there into the universe. We'll see if the universe picks it up.
Oh man, what do I want to see? I mean, I feel like there's somebody's got to have some interesting takes on the improved air quality and such we're seeing from the coronavirus. I feel like there's going to be some non-intuitive ways that's going to impact us going forward.
Yeah, we've kind of been purposely avoiding COVID content just because I think people need a break, man.
Yep. I feel like this is only tangentially related.
I want to talk about this Burmese amber situation. all these papers coming out with like fossils trapped in the Burmese amber, but there's like a lot of human rights issues. I want to get into it. Let's get this sorted. So those are our predictions.
Science sorted.
That's our spin-off show. Come on, boffins.
That's right.
That would have to be hosted by Raymond Terrific.
Say it, sorted.
And if we are able to sort things out, we'll make another episode about that, and you'll hear it when you come back and refresh your feed, and there's a new episode, and it's going to have a whole lot more science.
Sort of.
Sorted.
Visit sciencesortof.com for show notes, links to all the stories we talked about, and ways to interact with the hosts, guests, and other listeners. Science Sort of is brought to you by the Brachiolobe Media Network of podcasts, with audio engineering by Tim Dobbs of the Encyclopedia Brunch podcast. That's all for this week. See you next time on Science Sort of.
Neanderthal is a weird word because I always go back and forth between Neanderthal and Neanderthal.
Yeah.
I'm not sure which is correct.
I think it's supposed to be tall, but
is it a German word originally?
I don't know.
Oh no, it's just English. Oh, it is. It's based in the region of Germany called Neanderthal.
Yeah, that's cool. That makes sense, I suppose.
Jural Mountains.
Oh, really?
No, I was kidding. I was just thinking about other things in other place names in Germany that have a geologic name associated with them. The Jurassic.
Right.
That was what my brain did.
Lagerstätten.
Mm-hmm. Archaeopteryx.